Hi everyone. So today is the third part of our four-part series, Aggadah Story to Tell You. And throughout each of the classes, we're looking at the famous legends, the Aggadot from the Talmud, but looking at them with new eyes. So much time is spent, and I'm sure if we were to only spend all of our classes only looking at the texts themselves, we'd have so many ideas to share. But I think that because these texts are so rich, we oftentimes don't even have the opportunity to look at the texts before them, after them, and bring them back into their original context to really start to see inner meanings and the inner rabbinic logic. And part of that inner rabbinic logic is to find out our own meanings and to continue the dialogue. And so the purpose of this series is to further the dialogue by looking at these texts, but then also trying to find deeper meanings through the context themselves. So on Thursday, we have Tisha B'Av, and the very well-known text about Tisha B'Av. There's actually a few texts that bring about the reason why the temple was destroyed, and I think that there's a rabbinic pain that emerges from that, of taking ownership over it. I think, like, in reality, if we were to look at the political context, it would be very, like, you could just say, we are a small people with a lot of heart, but Rome, they're just a giant civilization. How could we stand in the way of that? But I think that by seeing kind of like the rabbis take ownership over it, we see that kind of their inner pain, it comes through in that. So each part of the series, we've been creating our own creativity and creating our own songs. And last week, we came up with a very beautiful song. So I'll start the class with the song that we've created. In honor of respecting the 3 weeks, Rabbi Exler gave me permission to sing the songs a cappella, but next week, when we're able to hear all of the songs together and then also make the final song, eventually it'll all be you'll all be able to hear them in the non-a cappella version with all of the musical accompaniment. So here we go. This story is the story of ages. Oh, Rabbi Akiva and Ishmael, the unity lasts. Menorah throughout generations past, with the change in forum, our Beit Midrash needs decorum. You get rash, then you just start to ignore them. We meet ourselves there, they're earnest and purposeful, to find our inclination in reality. Our souls are entwined into divine, and they are inclined toward the mind. Rabbi Akiva found infinite meaning in each and every crown. Oh, the Targum remind us we have purpose and worth on God's glorious earth. Unity lasts, menorah throughout generations past, with the change in forum, tumultuous Beit Midrash needs decorum. When you start to think rash, you ignore. Every month there's a renewal. sacred and impure, polluted and withheld, like the minnow. Some things cannot be made impure. Everything comes back to oneness of unity. 22 ornaments, 22 crowns, all come from God's infinity. Learning, going through the generations, adding layers of interpretation, innovation, continual vitality. Unity lasts. Menorah throughout generations past, with a change in form. This Beit Midrash needs decorum. Rabbi Ishmael, don't ignore. It was there all along at Sinai, but we didn't see it till now. Thank you, everyone. Everyone, this is your creativity coming to the surface, and I think that that's part of the continuing in the dialogue, that we build off of the layers of interpretation, and we invite ourselves into that conversation. So thank you, everyone, for participating in this project. And now we move ourselves to the tale of Kamsa bar Kamsa, and the story of Kamsa bar Kamsa is one that the rabbis use it as the story as the proof text of Sinat Chinam, as the cause of the destruction of the temple, that there was baseless hatred. But interestingly enough, Sinat Chinam finds itself in Yoma, finds itself in another place. They use that proof, and repeatedly throughout the text of Kamsa bar Kamsa, they actually base it off of embarrassment and humility. They kind of have different points where they bring those proof texts, but I think that there's a that when you read the text of whether you find it through embarrassment, whether you find different things, what you see is a really human text of people reacting through their emotions and anger. And that kind of chain reaction eventually we see it leads to the destruction of the temple. One thing before we get into it, kind of like opening up this conversation of context, I'd like to just share one envelope of a thought. Let me share the screen. Sorry. One entryway into this conversation is that in Gittin, in Masechet Gittin, we find this text of Kamsa bar Kamsa. Not only do we find this text of Kamsa bar Kamsa in Gittin, but the story starts exactly. Let me pull up here. It starts exactly in chapter 5 of 9, and exactly the middle daf of this chapter, exactly in the middle, and exactly the Mishnah starts exactly in the middle of the daf. There's after 4 chapters, and then after 7 pages of Gemara, and then after 28 lines. So there's like inner rabbinic numbers of 4 times 7 and 28. But regardless, really what we see that this story starts at the exact middle of Masachet Gittin, the Masachet about divorce and kind of working through divorce. Gittin is, in our day and age, I think, a real example of this, of where the chain reaction of anger and hatred really culminates. The Aguna crisis of people being get deniers to their spouses comes from this escalation of emotion and anger and hatred. And exactly in the middle, exactly in the middle of the middle of the middle, we see that this kind of this thread that's prying itself of baseless hatred at the heart of Gittin. We see that's really the core. So it's a little thought about kind of what we can find if we look at context, even on a larger scale, but I want to use our time to really go into the text. So the first thing to do, there's 3 parts to this, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all 3 parts to really kind of get to the fullness of the idea that I'm trying to demonstrate here. But before we do, let's begin with the text of Kamsa bar Kamsa. So the Gemara explains that Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa bar Kamsa. This is as there was a certain man who had a friend named Kamsa, and whose enemy was named bar Kamsa. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go bring me my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy bar Kamsa. The man who was hosting the feast came and found bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. Oy. In his special moment, in this special day, for some reason, he looks and he sees his enemy who's there. Now we can just kind of imagine his inner dialogue in this moment of that bar Kamsa came to my special day. Of course he did it because he's trying to ruin it. This is always the thing that bar Kamsa always does to me. He has to ruin me, maybe it's a birthday party, maybe it's a wedding, maybe it's a festival, and he has to come here and rain on my parade. That's how he starts to escalate in his own mind. And the host said to bar Kamsa, "That man is the enemy of that man." He's saying it kind of reflective about himself. He's saying, "You are my enemy. What then do you want here? Arise and leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "Since I have already come, let me stay, and I will give you money for whatever I eat and drink." He'll take care of his own portion. Just don't embarrass me by sending me out. The host said to him, "No, you must leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "I'll give you money for half of the feast. I'll pay for half of the party for you. Just don't send me away. Don't embarrass me." The host said to him, "No, you must leave." Bar Kamsa then said to him, "I will give you money for the entire feast. Just let me stay." The host said to him, "No, you must leave." And perhaps he's entitled, it's his party. He is the arbiter of who can come and who can't come. But we see that he was very angry, very heated in this moment. Finally, the host took bar Kamsa by his own hand, stood him up, and took him out. Now, bar Kamsa took this as a great embarrassment, as a great offense, but not only that, but he saw that the rabbis who were there were silent. So after having been cast out of the feast, bar Kamsa said to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest the actions of the host, although they saw how he humiliated me, learned from it, and very there's something so beautiful that he says, Shema Mina, that he uses the language of the rabbis, the rabbinic language of, we learn from it. He says, learn from it, that they were content with what he did. And I will therefore go and inform Echul Korza against them to the king. Echul Korza, the head of the Jerusalem, overseeing Jerusalem from the Romans. He went and said to the emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, who said that this is the case? Bar Kamsa said to him, go and test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government and see whether they will sacrifice it. The emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. While Bar Kamsa was coming with the calf to the temple, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip. Some say maybe it was the eyelid, but regardless, according to Roman law, the upper lip and the eyelid is not deemed a blemish. According to our own law, it is a blemish that you can't, because they also sacrificed animals, but according to their own laws, that animal would be deemed holy enough to be sacrificed. So then the blemish notwithstanding, the sages thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. There is halachic pretense for them to sacrifice the calf, but Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkulus said to them, if the priests do that, people will say that blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. So they had their original ruling, and then it was overturned in the second ruling. Then the sages said, well, if we don't sacrifice it, then maybe what we need to do is to prevent Bar Kamsa from reporting this to the emperor. The sages thought maybe perhaps we should kill him so that it doesn't escalate, that he would not go back and speak against them. And Rabbi Zachariah said to them, if you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed. As a result, they did nothing. Bar Kamsa's slander was accepted by the authorities, and consequently, the war between the Jews and the Romans began. Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkulus destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. But this action of Zachariah ben Avkulus is part of the last step of this chain reaction. And what we see is that we look at the end, but when we dial things back, all the way back, perhaps what really killed the Jewish people was the servant of the host, the meal of the host, who mixed up Kamsa Bar Kamsa. At the end of the day, you can say there are a slew of individuals who are to blame, but really what's to blame at the heart of everything is this escalation of anger, this sinat chinam, baseless hatred, that only really presents itself as the reason, not here, but in Yoma. So interestingly, Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur are two different holidays of fasting of 25 hours, and we see that kind of like the Yom Kippur, after Av, we have Elul, and then we have Tishrei, we have time to kind of reflect on our actions. In Masechet Yoma, then we see this idea like, wow, we're able to reflect all the way back to say, was it the shame of the humility of Rav Zachariah ben Avkulus? It was the sinat chinam that we eventually find ourselves when we meander through the Talmud. But let's stay focused to the story. Yes.
So what bothers me is obviously there's a dispute going on between Bar Kamsa and the host. Why didn't Bar Kamsa say, I'm sorry for my past behavior? He didn't have to pay any money. If he had just apologized for his past behavior to the host and come to him with humility and said, I'm sorry, this is a situation. I'm sorry and my past behavior. If you don't embarrass me now, I promise I won't behave like that anymore.
Beautiful.
Maybe then he wouldn't have taken revenge like he did.
I think that's such a there's so much wisdom in that statement of, we look at the anger of the host, but it takes two to tango in conflict, and like the ego of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, of like you're kind of like, he's feeling like in this moment, why are you doing an injustice? But if he really recognizes the fullness of their relationship, it's our own inability to do tshuva that perpetuates this kind of cycle of escalation. Beautiful. Right. Yes, Lance.
Well, from my perspective, Bar Kamsa is Satan. And I would suggest that if you read Plimo and Satan, you will see that there is a similar situation where you have a party and you have somebody coming into the party who is really disgusting, ugly, an enemy, if you will. And the point is that welcoming a stranger is really a major premise in Judaism that transcends all of what's going on here. In other words, for me, this is a satirical attack on rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah. It's so powerful. And I think kind of in my own unpacking of the story, it feels like after the tale of like Bar Kamsa being kicked out of the party, you do have I have empathy for the character a little bit, but then also how could I have empathy for the individual who then escalates it to the point where he says, the rabbis, this is a broken system from the rabbis, let me destroy it all and let me burn down the whole. What we like, it's hard to say. He was clearly bullied in that moment, and in some ways he was right. Where were the rabbis in that moment? Where were they to defend the justice?
He was right, but it was an overreaction.
And it was an overreaction.
That wasn't necessary.
Exactly. So I want to present an idea that actually, if when we read the story, what we see is that Bar Kamsa is the one who he uses the rabbinic logic in his favor, but against the rabbis. He uses rabbinic devices, even when he says Shema Mina, even when he uses kind of our halacha against the Roman halacha, he uses that in his advantage. And I think that is something that, like, when we extend back out to the context of Gittin, and we see that a lot of Gittin is an attempt to, and in today's day and age, it hasn't lived up to that standard, but it's an attempt to try and create structures of moments when people are heated and angry, and to try and protect them from making these decisions that, like, people begin to use halacha against other people. And so from that end, I want to suggest actually that yes, Bar Kamsa actually is satanic. I don't know if in my understanding, I haven't had that, like, I haven't read the text that you shared, Lance, but like, to a certain extent, I think through what I'm going to try and show, we can see that inner logic kind of potentially present itself. It's you have to read it with that in mind. So let's go back to the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, it seems like when we get to the end of this Mishnah and we get to the initial halachic conversation of the Gemara, it feels like it's a total that the Aggadah that we see from the story on like, it's about 6 half pages of Gemara that end up taking the span of the character of Vespasian and Titus and all of these different stories, and Bar Kamsa is starts it, but then it goes into all of these other stories. It feels like we've totally departed from the halachic conversation, and I want to suggest that there's actually many parallels in this halachic conversation that we can see. But even the halachic conversations, we have to see, like, the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa gives us new insight into them. So, the law of Sikari. The Sikari Khan were individuals who were part of the rebels. They were Jewish, but there were, like, different types of Jews. There were the Tzedokim, there were the Sikarim, who were a sect within the Bir Yonim. There were the Perushim, the rabbis, and there were the Anisis, the Anisim. And so there were these 4 different sects that kind of were among Jews. There, I guess, also Christianity. There were others, but these were the 4 main Jewish sects. And the Sikarim were bullies. So there was a period of laws. There was a 3-part period where the Romans were saying that that you can kill Jews, and in that period, the Sikarim used that people kind of in their hopelessness bullied people into acquiring land, and so they basically, this halacha says that anyone who, like, acquired land through the Sikarim, we have to, like, and then eventually the Sikarim sold it out. How do we handle this, like, this coerced exchange? Do we say that it's valid, or how does halacha deal with this very particular historic moment? And to the extent where like the story of Bar Kamsa and all the other stories feel like a departure from this halacha conversation, the typical understanding, like it's very clear that we're talking about this very specific period, and the rabbis use it as an opportunity to then talk about all of these Aggadic tales from that period. But I want to say that actually maybe there's something to be learned about this halacha. So if there's an individual who purchases land in this period, and then afterward the buyer returned and purchased the same field a second time from the prior landowner. It's very complicated, but just to simplify it, Reuven is forced to sell his land to a Sikari. The Sikari eventually owns the land and then sells it to Shimon. When Shimon eventually has the land and he goes back to Reuven, the halacha says that he has to give it directly back to Reuven. Reuven was coerced and it was illegitimate. So halachically, in the end, Reuven actually can kind of subvert the halachic system with ill intent. He can kind of play games where he can say, "Oh, I was coerced," and then he gets the $1,000. If let's say the land cost $1,000, he gets the full amount of money back. He keeps the full amount of money that he got from the Sikari, and he gets the land. It's the best of all worlds. So we see that there's this tricky moment. There's this character who's being bullied by a Sikari. So we want to allow him to have his land back, his rightfully owned land. But there's this confusing moment. So the Gemara continues and says, but if Reuven sold it and then he sold it back, and then eventually the Sikari sold it from him, then we can see that Reuven, the original owner, didn't really have an attachment to the land, and whether he was bullied or not, he doesn't have a right to reclaim the land afterwards. That's this halacha. It continues with another halacha that talks about a wife, a woman who comes into a marriage with a lot of money and owns land. If someone purchases it from the husband and he never got confirmation from the rightful owner, the wife, whether or not that purchase is valid, then it invalidates that purchase. If the woman actually was the rightful owner, then you cannot assume that through her silence. You're not able to, the Gemara says that through her silence, assume that she wanted to give over the land. So we have these two cases. One case of an individual being bullied, and what is the status of the sale that eventually happens through being bullied. And the second is kind of the assumptions that go on, that there is information through silence, information through omission, and so when we go to the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, just on the surface level, what we see are these two moments enact themselves at the party. First, we have this moment of Kamsa Bar Kamsa being bullied by the person who's running the party. And all of a sudden, at the end of it, he feels justified in order that the means justify the ends because of that. One, because of him being bullied, and two, because of the silence of the rabbis and the information that he accrues through the silence of the rabbis. By both standards, well, by the original standard, the being bullied does eventually work in the favor of the original person, but the silence doesn't. And so Kamsa's retaliation against all of the Jewish people is kind of unfounded. If we were to make that parallel, are you all following? Now, but this Mishnah actually continues in a very fascinating way. The Mishnah continues to say that this is the initial version of the Mishnah, and later the court of those who came after the sages, who composed that Mishnah said. So they said that actually probably this isn't the best halachic system, that someone can be bullied, and then at the end of it, you can say, oh, I get full ownership over the land, and I get I get to keep the $1,000 that I got from the Sikari. And so later on in the Gemara, we won't have time to look at the Gemara. They actually spell out this kind of like that, where these halachas are hard to understand, because how do we know the inner workings of someone's mind? How do we understand their intention? And it creates a hole for things to kind of fall apart. And so there's like a revote, and the revote actually says that that the person is able to come back to Kamsa Bar Kamsa, sorry, not Kamsa, come back to the original owner of the land. They're able to ask the original owner of the land whether or not they're able to like receive back their land, but they have to pay. They don't get it for free. They have to pay it back, but they're the first person, they get the first priority to pay it back. And if they don't have the money to pay it back, you can even return a quarter of the land. So we see that there's like this middle ground of like trying to give benefit of the doubt to the original person, and at the same time saying that it's only fair that he pays back the land, otherwise he could have had this ill intent. And then the rabbis go, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, interestingly enough, who's the last of the Tanaim, so clearly this is much later, ruled that actually after a 12-month period that if the Sikari owned the land, after a 12-month period, all bets are off, and anyone can purchase the land. That like we can see the person's intention if he doesn't immediately come to action and try and repurchase the land. But until then, he gets first priority. So we see in these kind of like re-evaluations of halacha, what we see is that the halacha becomes more and more strict on the person, thinking about the person who might use halacha to their advantage. And kind of in parallel with the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, we see a little allusion to that story, where Rav Zachariah kind of overturns what would seem originally rational. He overturns it, and then he overturns it the second action, and we kind of like have that played out a little bit in this Mishnah. We see parallels, but what we end up with, the final halacha that we end up with, gives us an emphasis on the status of the Sikari. And it's so fascinating if we think about this idea of sinat chinam, of baseless hatred, because if we think about the rabbinic logic that would go on in like the aftermath of that original halacha, what it would incentivize are for people to not deal with the Sikarim at all. Why would someone go out of their way to buy back the land to then return it to the original rightful owner? And what do you gain out of it? You get nothing. So this creates an incentivized structure to kind of have social divergence between individuals who are clearly in conflict with one another, individuals who don't jive with one another, the Sikarim and the Pirushim and the Tzedukim. There was deep tensions between the groups, but this type of halacha further creates divides between people. And by the end, by the second and the third, humanizing the Sikarim, or like understanding that like the original person might also have incentives to have kind of like subverted the halacha, it creates a more holistic picture that protects all parties. That the original person has an opportunity to reclaim his land, but he has to pay in full, and the Sikarim, and it creates a complete society where people are kind of in it all together. Yes, Lance.
Aren't the Sikari equivalent to Puritans and the right-wing government in Israel right now?
I mean, I would say that the Sikarim are, like in the rabbinic eye, they're like idolaters. They're not even like they're Jewish, but they're this completely different sect. And so it like it makes sense. I don't want to get into I'm not sure. There's a lot of parallels also of trying to kind of like understand the status of Israel today, where there's a lot of division between parties as well, for sure. But yeah, I think to your point of like, are they like in? I'm not sure. For me, how I understand it, the original person who gets bullied by the Sikari then utilizes the halachic system to kind of get his gain, to kind of shove it to the Sikari in a way. And so by the end of the halacha, by the second and then the third court convening, which is, it's very rare to see that a Mishnah says, this is the first version of the Mishnah, because it's like almost breaking the fourth wall. But it's kind of saying that it's showing us a way of thinking about society more holistically.
What do you mean by the fourth wall?
When it says Zo Mishnah Rishona, there are a few times when the Mishnah kind of like says this is the first Mishnah and then continue, or like this is the version, continues, but it's very rare. And for like the Mishnah to kind of
what is the fourth wall?
I think like the Mishnah is read and taught in a way where it says this is the halacha. It oftentimes doesn't give us a read where this is the first halacha, and now we have a second and a third halacha that are in contradiction with the first. It usually tells us this is the halacha, and maybe another rabbi has a different opinion, but not that the Mishnah itself has grown in its understanding and in its nuance. So that in itself is just a fascinating way of opening up, where eventually we go into the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, where we think, do people have the opportunity, kind of as Carol said, does Bar Kamsa have the ability in himself? Does he have the ability in himself to say, you know, I was wrong and I'm sorry? Do people need to act in themselves as wholly consistent, that we're not able to do tshuva and we're not able to kind of amend and grow? It's demonstrated in our Mishnah itself. And so I just, to bring all of this together, the Mishnah, the Gemara goes through story after story after story after story. And it finishes, near the end, where I'd say that, like, you think that at that point, we're not talking about Kamsa Bar Kamsa anymore. But like shortly after that story, the Gemara kind of says, it like brings it back to Kamsa Bar Kamsa in a very interesting way, where it says, to conclude the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa at 57a, when we started it at 56a. So a whole daf of different stories come. It's bookended with here. So it's like we're still in the conversation, still in the dialogue of Kamsa Bar Kamsa. We have this story near the end. And this story is a fascinating story that talks about one of the great moments of redemption between like being able to keep the Torah alive when Jerusalem was under siege, is this moment when Abba Sikara, the leader of the entire Biryoni sect, the sect of the Zealots of the Jerusalem, he was the nephew of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And we don't have time to go through the full story, but he plans Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's escape. And he gets him out of Jerusalem and he builds the yeshiva in Yavne. And he gets him out by telling him, what you have to do is you have to fake your death and be like very serious about faking your death. He ends up putting him in a coffin and he gets out. And what we see in this, where we see really a parallel between this and the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, is that on his way out, they tried the Biryoni guards tried to stab him to make sure to see whether or not he was dead. And Abba Sikari comes and saves the day and said, "Are you going to stab your teacher? Are you going to stab a wise person?" And he prevents them from stabbing. And kind of like the stabbing that Bar Kamsa does as he's bringing it up to the temple in this moment of deceit, and like all of it comes together, where all of the parallels come together. But the thing that I want to highlight and bring up is that the hero of the story, the person who we glamorize and say this person had the humanity to break the cycle of anger and vengeance, is Abba Sikari, is the head of this group. When we're able to bridge the gaps of division, when we're able to protect people, and even though it's in a moment, it's in an intense moment, and the ability that Torah lived on in the yeshiva in Yavne, it only comes about. It's only possible through, if we go all the way back to the Mishnah, not using halacha against people, but bringing the divisions between the different groups back together. And I think that narrative forces us to think about the bully, thinking the person who tells Bar Kamsa to leave, that we need to think about all of the people, Bar Kamsa, and all of the characters involved, that when they're in the confronting their own enemy, when they're in a heated moment of conflict, they bridge the gap together at the end of the story. Abba Sikari, the leader of the Biryonim, he's able to cross that divide and find his own inner humanity.
Can I just say, rolling it back to the story, I think, it comes to show us also that there are many points of entry, and there are many points of, just from a human perspective, to say, where people could stop and say, you know what, actually, if I look at my little segment of this is where I erred, because from the very beginning of the story, actually Bar Kamsa ended up being invited to the mishter, to the party or whatever it was. There was an error. I mean, the host never said, "Oh, there was a mix-up. I invited you, but somebody brought the wrong person." So, I mean, he could also have been, as a human story, maybe not where it ends up going. It could have been, he could have made an intervention at that point to say, wait a minute, you know what? It was on me. I made this error, but he let it go and said, you know, I have this issue, you're here and focusing. And I don't know if at that point, I mean, maybe Carol's right that Bar Kamsa could have said at that point, you know what, maybe I am so sorry, for what I did. Maybe he shouldn't have come knowing that there was a conflict. Or maybe he should have said, you know what, I'm deeply sorry, I'm here, I was invited. Did he know? Did he know that he wasn't supposed to be invited? Was it a setup to bring him there and then to send him away? It's like people start thinking in their heads all sorts of things when there's conflict. So how do you intervene at an earlier point before it keeps, escalating like that? But I think it says if you don't intervene early, things just keep getting worse and worse.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful
Points.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, from one perspective, what you're doing is you're projecting contemporary psychology onto this situation. And number two, the historian Gedalia Alon contends that the whole thing about Yavna, the whole thing about a rabbi meeting Vespasian, the whole thing about the coincidence was suddenly he becomes the emperor kind of thing, it's all contrived, it's all fiction. And there's absolutely nothing. But the key, it seems to me, is the mistake that starts this thing and the odd coincidence in which the rabbi is given a high position. They're both what Mircea Eliade calls hierophanies. You familiar with that term?
No.
Okay, a hierophany is a manifestation of the sacred in the profane. It's a manifestation of God in everyday kind of things. For example, instead of God being an anthropomorphic theophany, a person, which we see in Exodus, for example, it's God is simply embedded in nature and is controlling everything, but communicating with us through the handwriting on a wall, or communicating with us through the burning bush, communicating to us with natural everyday things. And among those are coincidences, mistakes, the unexpected, all these things. The problem is, in order to accept that position, you have to see that God is here, God is there, God is everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's in some way maybe the criticism of Rabbi Zachariah where they say the temple was destroyed because of humility, and like obviously in that moment it's a critique, but like maybe what they're saying to what you're saying is we need more humility. The temple was destroyed because there was that this idea of humility, of seeing Hashem in everything, would even give I think would give Reb Zachariah the courage to take that offering up and recognize that like Hashem understands what's going on in our heart. We should trust ourselves, and we should trust that Hashem kind of is ruler over everything. And I love that point of thinking about what my mother said around the human error, and then what kind of lands to your point of we need to see the fullness of the picture.
You gotta look at in the chat there. Robert has made a point about the fourth wall. Do you see that? And actually,
what does he say?
Robert, you want to read that?
Oh, I don't see that.
In the chat.
I'll go back to the chat just a minute.
Yeah.
It's in like the theater. It's the fourth wall. It's the metaphorical divide between cast and audience, and theatrical effect of you don't have to pay for it if you break it.
Right. Two examples.
Or acknowledge or
Robert.
addresses the audience, usually
Excellent
of a
point.
comedic effort or an avant-garde experience.
Right. Two examples would be George Burns, who is constantly talking to the audience, and Ferris Bueller, who does exactly the same thing. In other words, normally when we see all the comps or bar comps or whatever, it's a sealed play, a sealed performance. But if you spill out over into the audience and you allow a character to start talking to you, that is the breach of the fourth wall.
Right.
Okay. But there's no breach of the fourth wall that I can see really anywhere in Tanakh. Can you or in Talmud? Is there any character ever talk directly to the reader?
I can't think of any moment.
There is something.
I'll think about it. I want for the creative piece of this class here. I'll turn off the recording. Stop recording.